Gulf of Tonkin. In August 1964, the United States government announced that North Vietnamese patrol boats had attacked two U.S. Navy destroyers, the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, in the Gulf of Tonkin. President Lyndon B. Johnson told the public the attacks were unprovoked acts of aggression by North Vietnam. The incident was immediately used to request broad military authority from Congress, resulting in the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed massive escalation of the Vietnam War. Later investigations and declassified intelligence revealed that the first confrontation involved warning shots during covert U.S. operations near North Vietnamese waters, while the second reported attack on August 4th almost certainly never occurred. Radar readings and sonar signals were misinterpreted, yet officials presented the event as a confirmed attack. Declassified documents from the National Security Agency showed analysts had serious doubts about the second attack, but those doubts were not shared publicly. Katyn massacre. In 1940, thousands of Polish military officers, police officials, and intellectuals held as prisoners by the Soviet Union were executed by the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, in a series of mass shootings later known as the Katyn massacre. The killings took place primarily in forests near Katyn, Smolensk, and several other locations after orders approved by Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Politburo. When German forces discovered mass graves in 1943 and publicized them, the government of the Soviet Union immediately denied responsibility and accused Nazi Germany of committing the executions during the German occupation of the region. The truth remained officially suppressed until 1990, when Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev acknowledged that the NKVD had carried out the executions. In 2010, the Russian government released additional archival documents confirming that Stalin and senior Soviet officials had ordered the massacre, Operation Himmler. In August 1939, the government of Nazi Germany secretly organized a series of staged attacks along the German-Polish border known as Operation Himmler. These operations were designed to create the appearance that Poland had launched violent attacks against Germany, providing propaganda justification for a planned invasion. The operation was organized by Nazi security forces under German leader Adolf Hitler. The most famous staged incident occurred at the Gleiwitz radio station near the border. German operatives dressed in Polish uniforms seized the station briefly and broadcast an anti-German message before leaving behind the bodies of prisoners who had been killed and dressed to resemble Polish attackers. These victims were referred to as canned goods, meant to serve as fabricated evidence of a Polish assault. The following day, Hitler publicly claimed that Germany had been attacked by Polish forces and used this claim to justify launching a full military invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. After the war, testimony and documentation presented during the Nuremberg trials revealed the operation had been entirely staged. Lavon Affair. In 1954, operatives linked to Israeli military intelligence carried out a covert sabotage campaign in Egypt targeting libraries, cinemas, and Western facilities. The operation, later known as the Lavon Affair, aimed to plant bombs that would be blamed on Egyptian nationalist groups. The objective was to create instability and damage relations between Egypt and Western powers such as the United States and the United Kingdom, potentially slowing the withdrawal of British forces from the region. The operation collapsed when several agents were arrested by Egyptian authorities after one of the bombs prematurely exploded, exposing the network. For years, the government of Israel denied official involvement, and the incident triggered a political crisis inside Israel. Investigations and archival evidence later confirmed that the sabotage operation had indeed been organized by Israeli intelligence. Chernobyl disaster. In April 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded during a safety test, releasing massive amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The disaster occurred in the Soviet Union and immediately became the worst nuclear accident in history. Local authorities initially gave almost no information to the public, and nearby residents were not immediately informed about the scale of the radiation danger. The Soviet government attempted to control information about the accident for several days. Officials delayed evacuations and issued minimal statements while radiation spread across large parts of Europe. The disaster became impossible to conceal when radiation monitoring stations in Sweden detected unusually high radiation levels and traced the contamination back toward Soviet territory. Under international pressure, Soviet authorities eventually acknowledged that a major nuclear accident had occurred. Later investigations and released Soviet archives revealed that early reports had significantly minimized the scale of the explosion and the dangers of radiation exposure. Bloody Sunday. On January 30, 1972, British soldiers opened fire on civil rights demonstrators during a protest march in the city of Derry. 14 unarmed civilians were killed in what became known as Bloody Sunday. The shootings occurred during the conflict known as the Troubles and involved troops from the British Army's Parachute Regiment. Immediately after the event, the government of the United Kingdom claimed that soldiers had come under attack from gunmen and bomb throwers before opening fire. An initial investigation known as the Widgery Tribunal largely supported the Army's version of events and suggested that some victims may have been armed militants. Decades later, a far more extensive investigation called the Saville Inquiry re-examined the evidence, including eyewitness testimony and ballistic analysis. In 2010, the report concluded that none of the victims had posed a threat and that the shootings were unjustified. British Prime Minister David Cameron formally apologized, acknowledging that the killings were wrong. Iran-Contra affair. During the 1980s, the government of the United States publicly stated that it would not negotiate with terrorists and would not sell weapons to Iran, which was under a strict arms embargo. Despite this position, members of the administration of Ronald Reagan secretly approved the sale of U.S. weapons to Iranian intermediaries. At the same time, money from those weapons deals was secretly redirected to support the Contra rebel forces fighting the government of Nicaragua. This violated the Boland Amendment, a U.S. law that prohibited American government agencies from funding the Contras. The operation remained hidden until 1986, when reports in the press and subsequent investigations revealed the secret program, Bhopal disaster. In December 1984, a chemical plant owned by Union Carbide in the city of Bhopal, India, released a massive cloud of toxic gas after a storage tank containing methyl isocyanate leaked during the night. Thousands of people living near the factory died within hours and many more were injured. The disaster quickly became known as the Bhopal disaster, one of the deadliest industrial accidents in history. In the immediate aftermath, officials connected to the company and local authorities in India initially minimized the scale and long-term danger of the gas exposure. Early statements suggested that the situation was under control and that the chemicals involved were not likely to cause lasting harm. Over time, medical studies and investigations revealed that the toxic exposure had caused widespread long-term illnesses, birth defects, and environmental contamination affecting hundreds of thousands of people. Korean Airlines. On September 1, 1983, a civilian airliner, Korean Flight 007, was shot down by a Soviet fighter jet after it accidentally entered restricted Soviet airspace. All 269 passengers and crew were killed. The aircraft had departed from New York City and was traveling to Seoul when it drifted off its intended flight path. After the incident, the government of the Soviet Union initially denied responsibility and claimed it had no knowledge of shooting down a civilian aircraft. Years later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, released military recordings and documents showed that Soviet pilots had identified the aircraft and fired missiles. Rainbow Warrior bombing. In July 1985, the Greenpeace ship Rainbow Warrior was preparing to lead protests against French nuclear testing in the Pacific Ocean while docked in the harbor of Auckland. During the night, explosive devices were attached to the ship's hull, causing it to sink. A photographer on board, Fernando Pereira, was killed in the explosion. Soon after the attack, the government of France denied involvement and claimed it had no connection to the bombing. However, investigators in New Zealand uncovered evidence that the attack had been carried out by agents from the French intelligence service, the DGSE. As the investigation progressed, several French operatives were arrested and the evidence became overwhelming. Under international pressure, the French government eventually admitted that its intelligence service had organized the sabotage operation. Dirty War disappearances. Between 1976 and 1983, the military government of Argentina carried out a campaign of repression against suspected political opponents during a period known as the Dirty War. Thousands of students, activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens were secretly kidnapped by security forces and taken to illegal detention centers. For years, the military regime denied responsibility and claimed that many of the missing individuals had voluntarily left the country or joined extremist groups. Families searching for relatives received little information, while authorities refused to acknowledge the arrests. After the dictatorship ended in 1983, investigations by the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons documented executions carried out by the state. The findings were published in the report Nunca Más Bay of Pigs Invasion. In April 1961, a group of Cuban exiles launched an invasion of Cuba at a location known as the Bay of Pigs. The attack was presented publicly as an independent effort by Cuban rebels attempting to overthrow the government of Fidel Castro. At the time, officials from the government of the United States denied direct military involvement. In reality, the invasion had been organized, funded, and trained by the CIA. The operation had originally been planned during the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower and was later approved by John F. Kennedy after he took office. The invasion quickly failed when Cuban forces defeated the Exile Brigade within a few days. As captured fighters revealed details of the operation and documents became public, it became clear that the United States had secretly organized the mission. My Lai Massacre. In March 1968, U.S. soldiers entered the village of My Lai during the Vietnam War and killed hundreds of unarmed civilians, including women, children, and elderly people. The killings were carried out by troops from Charlie Company of the U.S. Army. The event later became known as the My Lai Massacre. Immediately after the operation, official military reports from the government of the United States described the event as a successful battle against enemy fighters and claimed large numbers of Viet Cong had been killed. The reports did not mention that most of the victims were civilians. More than a year later, the truth began to emerge when soldiers who had witnessed the killings reported what happened, and journalists investigated the story. Photographs and testimony confirmed that hundreds of civilians had been deliberately killed. A U.S. Army investigation later acknowledged the massacre. Operation Northwoods. In 1962, senior military officials of the United States created a secret proposal called Operation Northwoods. The plan was developed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff during tensions with the government of Cuba, led by Fidel Castro. The proposal suggested staging or simulating attacks against American targets, including hijackings, bombings, or incidents involving civilians, which would then be blamed on Cuba. These incidents would be used to justify military intervention against the Cuban government during the Cold War. The plan was presented to President John F. Kennedy but was ultimately rejected and never carried out. The existence of the proposal remained secret for decades, until declassified government documents revealed it in the 1990s. During World War II, the Imperial Japanese military operated a secret biological warfare program known as Unit 731 in occupied Manchuria. The program was led by military Dr. Shiro Ishii and conducted experiments on thousands of prisoners, including civilians and captured soldiers. Prisoners were exposed to diseases such as plague, cholera, and anthrax, and many were subjected to extreme experiments including vivisection without anesthesia. The operations were kept secret by the government of Japan during and after the war. For years after 1945, the existence and scale of the program were largely denied or avoided in official discussions. Later historical research, testimonies, and released records confirmed the extent of the biological warfare experiments carried out by Unit 731. MK Ultra program. During the Cold War, the CIA secretly ran a research project called Project MK Ultra, a program aimed to study methods of psychological manipulation, interrogation, and possible mind control techniques during the rivalry with the Soviet Union. Researchers funded by the CIA conducted experiments involving drugs such as LSD, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and other psychological methods. Many of these experiments were carried out without the informed consent of the people involved, including students, prisoners, hospital patients, and ordinary citizens. The existence of the program remained secret for years, until investigations by the United States Senate during the 1970s uncovered it as part of the Church Committee inquiry into intelligence agencies. Zimmermann telegram. In January 1917, British intelligence intercepted a secret diplomatic message sent by the government of Germany to officials in Mexico. The message, later known as the Zimmermann telegram, proposed that Mexico join Germany in a military alliance if the United States entered the war against Germany. The telegram promised that Germany would support Mexico in recovering territories it had lost to the United States in the 19th century, including Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. After British codebreakers decoded the message, the British government passed it to the United States. When the telegram was made public, German officials initially tried to cast doubt on its authenticity. Soon afterward, however, German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann publicly admitted that the message was genuine. NSA global surveillance. In 2013, classified documents revealed that the National Security Agency had been running large-scale global surveillance programs that collected phone records, internet data, and communications from millions of people. The programs were operated by the government of the United States and involved cooperation with major telecommunications and technology companies. The information became public after former NSA contractor Edward Snowden leaked thousands of secret files to journalists. Reports published by newspapers such as The Guardian and The Washington Post described surveillance systems that collected global communications data, including programs like PRISM. Downing of Malaysia Airlines. On July 17, 2014, a passenger aircraft, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, was shot down while flying over eastern Ukraine during the conflict in the region. The aircraft was traveling from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur when it was destroyed, killing all 298 passengers and crew on board. Soon after the incident, Authorities in Russia denied involvement and suggested alternative explanations, including claims that Ukrainian forces might have been responsible. An international investigation led by the Dutch Safety Board and the Joint Investigation Team concluded that the aircraft had been destroyed by a Buk surface-to-air missile launched from territory controlled by pro-Russian separatists. Evidence showed the missile system had been transported from Russia into eastern Ukraine before the attack. Syphilis experiment. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service began a medical study in Tuskegee to observe the progression of untreated syphilis in hundreds of African American men. Participants were told they were receiving treatment for bad blood, but they were never informed of the true purpose of the study. Even after penicillin became a proven cure for syphilis in the 1940s, researchers deliberately withheld treatment from the men in order to continue studying how the disease developed over time. The program continued for decades, while government officials did not disclose the full nature of the study to the participants. The experiment remained largely unknown to the public until 1972, when journalists exposed the study, revealing that hundreds of men had been misled and denied treatment. Japanese comfort women denial. During World War II, the Imperial Japanese military created a system of military brothels, known as comfort stations, where thousands of women from occupied territories were forced to provide physical services to soldiers. Many of the women came from regions such as Korea, China, and other areas under Japanese control. For decades after the war, the government of Japan maintained that the women had been voluntary prostitutes and denied direct military involvement in organizing the system. Survivors and historians argued that many women had been coerced, trafficked, or forced into the system by military authorities and recruiters. In 1993, Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono issued a statement acknowledging military involvement and the suffering of the women. Abu Ghraib prison abuse. In 2003 and 2004, detainees held at Abu Ghraib prison during the Iraq War were subjected to severe abuse by military members from the United States. Prisoners were photographed being humiliated, beaten, threatened by dogs, and forced into degrading positions while in custody. For months early, complaints about mistreatment were minimized or not widely acknowledged by officials. The situation became public in 2004, when photographs taken by soldiers inside the prison were leaked to journalists and broadcast by the television program 60 Minutes. The images caused international outrage and investigations were launched by the U.S. military and government. Several soldiers were later convicted in military courts, while inquiries found that detainee abuse had occurred at the prison. Soviet Biological Weapons Program. During the Cold War, the government of the Soviet Union secretly operated one of the largest biological weapons programs in history, despite signing international agreements banning such weapons. The program was managed through a network of laboratories and facilities under an organization called Biopreparat A. Scientists in these facilities worked on developing and weaponizing dangerous pathogens, such as anthrax, smallpox, and plague for potential military use. The existence of the program was kept secret for decades while the Soviet government publicly claimed it was complying with the Biological Weapons Convention. The scale of the program began to emerge after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when former scientists and officials revealed details about the research. One of the most prominent defectors, Ken Alibek, confirmed that the Soviet Union had continued developing biological weapons long after international treaties prohibited them. Pentagon Papers. In 1971, thousands of classified documents about the Vietnam War were leaked to the press. The documents, later known as the Pentagon Papers, were a secret study prepared by the United States Department of Defense analyzing decades of American involvement in Vietnam. The files were leaked by former military analyst Daniel Ellsberg, who gave the documents to newspapers including the New York Times. The documents showed that several administrations of the government of the United States had privately concluded that the war was unlikely to be won, while publicly claiming that progress was being made. When the government tried to stop publication, the case went to the Supreme Court, which ruled that newspapers could continue publishing the documents. Incubator babies testimony. In 1990, a dramatic testimony was presented before the United States Congress, claiming that Iraqi soldiers had removed babies from hospital incubators in Kuwait after the Iraqi invasion. The testimony was delivered by a young Kuwaiti woman identified only as Naira, who said she had witnessed soldiers leaving newborn infants on the floor to die. The story was widely reported by international media and repeated by political leaders, including George Bush, as evidence of atrocities committed by the government of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. The account played a significant role in shaping public opinion before the Gulf War. After the war, journalists and human rights investigators found no evidence that the incubator incident had occurred as described. It was later revealed that Nayyirah was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States, and that the testimony had been arranged as part of a public relations campaign organized by the firm, Hill and Knowlton, to build support for military intervention. Iran Air Flight 655. On July 3, 1988, a civilian passenger aircraft, Iran Air Flight 655, was shot down over the Strait of Hormuz by missiles fired from the U.S. Navy cruiser USS Vincennes, USS Vincennes. The aircraft had taken off from Bandar Abbas in Iran and was flying a scheduled commercial route to Dubai. All 290 passengers and crew were killed, including 65 children. At the time, the government of the United States said the ship's crew believed the aircraft was an attacking Iranian F-14 fighter jet during tensions in the Iran-Iraq War. Officials stated that warnings had been issued and that the shootdown occurred during a defensive military situation. Later investigations show the aircraft was a civilian plane flying along a normal commercial flight path and transmitting civilian identification signals while climbing after takeoff. The crew of the Vincennes had misidentified the aircraft as a military target before launching 2 missiles that destroyed it. Watergate cover-up. In June 1972, 5 men were arrested while breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee inside the Watergate complex. The break-in was connected to the re-election campaign of Richard Nixon. Soon after the arrests, officials from the government of the United States publicly denied that the White House had any involvement in the incident. Investigations by journalists and congressional committees later revealed that members of the Nixon administration had attempted to cover up the break-in. Secret recordings made inside the White House showed that senior officials had discussed obstructing the investigation and using government agencies to limit the inquiry. Facing almost certain impeachment, Nixon resigned from office in August 1974, becoming the first U.S. president to step down from the presidency. Iraq weapons of mass destruction claims. In the early 2000s, the government of the United States stated that the regime of Saddam Hussein possessed active stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons and was pursuing nuclear weapons. These claims were presented as a major justification for the 2003 invasion of Iraq during the Iraq War. Officials from the administration of George Bush and allied governments argued that Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction posed a serious threat to international security. Intelligence reports and public speeches claimed that Iraq had continued developing prohibited weapons despite earlier disarmament agreements. After the invasion, extensive searches by international inspectors and the Iraq Survey Group found no active stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction. Later investigations concluded that key intelligence used to support the claims had been flawed or exaggerated, leading to widespread criticism of the information used to justify the war.